I'm really excited that you're here this morning because I think you're going to really be in for a treat. We are really blessed and honored to have Rebecca and Gabe Lyons here with us this morning.
Hello. Good morning.
Rebecca and Gabe are from really far away. They traveled long distances this morning, about 25 miles from Franklin to come up and join us, made the commute. We're really excited to have you both here. And I could introduce you, but I would rather you take the opportunity just to tell us a little about who you are and what you do and the space that you hold in the world right now.
Well, my name's Gabe Lyons, and I just want to say we love Lipscomb, we love the Bisons. We get down here and support, sports teams, bring our kids. We have 4 children, and part of our journey over the last decade has been really trying to help educate Christians who are working in every area of culture, from media, entertainment, those who work in academia, those in government, those who work in business as entrepreneurs, to try to help them understand how faith applies to everything that they're touching and how God's called us in the world to be a part of creating culture, not just responding and reacting to the things we see around us or maybe criticizing and condemning those things, but actually to be a force for good in what God's trying to do in the world. And so we have an organization called Q. Some of you I know have participated in something called Q Union that happens every fall on this campus. And the whole design of that is to say, look, as Christians, there's no idea off limits. We should be able to talk about any subject matter. We should be able to bring some of the best thinking, be smart about it, stay curious, and work well on trying to help the world understand how we can flourish most when we actually bring all of God's ingenuity into any kind of process and creativity. So lots of books, resources, something called qideas.org that has hundreds of talks dealing with every kind of topic you could imagine. That's all based now in Franklin. We've lived here for about 4 years. Before that, we were in New York City, and prior to that, Atlanta. Wow. So that's my side of the story. Yeah. This is Rebecca, the best part of this duo.
We know.
Well, we've been married 21 years, and yes, I know, got a little rah-rah there. But so by default, I helped him with Q from the early days, and then he somehow drug me and our 3 kids and 2 toy poodles in a minivan to New York in 2010. And so that's where my calling vocation starts then. I wasn't looking for this or didn't ever imagine this, but in that season, I developed panic disorder for the first 2 years. And kind of God got real loud for me in that season. And from that healing journey, I began to write about that and talk about mental health and things like that. So that's kind of my jam.
Very cool.
It's kind of one of those sideways, like left hook vocations that you're not expecting, and you're like, oh, here's where we are, God. Okay.
And this is where I was supposed to be. This is what I've been preparing for. Yeah. That's really cool. Well, so I know one of the things that both of you do in your writing and running Q and trying to cultivate these spaces, one of the things you get to do is meet some really incredible people, and you get to hear their stories and learn from their experiences in life. And I'm curious, over the course of these years of gathering these stories, who kind of jumps to your mind in terms of a really influential person that's kind of helped form or shape the way that you want your life to look because of their story?
There's definitely a few. I have a hard time saying just one, but I mean, partly for me, I go back to even the books that I read that are from people who don't live anymore that have shaped so much of my thinking. I think of people like Francis Schaeffer, who created L'Abri over in Europe, and he, back in the 1950s and 60s, was articulating a way to think about the Christian faith that few people in that generation had considered, which was, what if God was trying to work through Christians to create a world that was more flourishing for everybody, not just for the church, but for our neighbors, for our friends and our colleagues. So that's been an influence. More modern history would be somebody like Tim Keller, Chuck Colson, who's no longer with us. People who really understood this role of Christians in the world, took seriously the cultural mandate. So lots of times in our churches, I know I grew up in this kind of environment, maybe some of you did too, a lot of the discussion around what it means to live out your faith has to do a lot with being a nice person, which is good. But secondly, witnessing, telling other people about the faith so that they can go to heaven one day, And sometimes we don't spend as much time talking about our purpose in this world. And part of what those leaders had consistently in what they talked about was the understanding that God has an assignment for each of us, for each of you, that the person sitting next to you is not going to be able to fulfill. Because God's put something in your heart that he wants to do with you. He wants to create with you. He doesn't just want you kind of reacting and responding to the chaos of the world. He's trying to do something right now, and we get to partner with him to do it. And so those would be mentors, and I would say the people now that inspire me are all of the stories. I mean, we, through Q, platform so many every year. In a couple of months, we'll do our main event. We'll have 35 talks take place, 9-minute talks down at Music City Center. 2,000 leaders will come in from all over. But we hear stories from people, like I think of a 25-year-old Brett Hagler who literally saw that there was a need in the world for better housing for people. He loved 3D printing, and he figured out how to 3D print houses out of concrete that literally can be created within a couple of days to set up homes so that people can have a safe place in South America that they can live and they can start to operate their lives. So it's that kind of ingenuity where he goes, look, God's given me a creative mind. I'm going to use it to help make this world better. And people like that, whose faith is motivating creativity in the world, those are some of the most inspiring people to me.
Yeah, that's incredible. Rebecca, does anyone come to your mind in terms of those stories? Or?
Yeah, I like books by dead people. So I know we're sounding like we're 80 right now, guys. I know. But the thing that when I started studying mental health on the other side of this is that I started to learn, 1 in 4 on medication for anxiety or depression. So I started to go, why is this the case? Are we now just a nation? Anxiety often is a fancy word for fear. And so I was just really curious, like, who has done research on this? Who has done a lot of work on this? And so I came across Viktor Frankl. Anyone? He is a Holocaust survivor. He survived 4 camps in 3 years, and he came up with this psychiatric just brilliance called logotherapy. So his predecessors, Freud, said we're made for pleasure, and Adler said we're made for power, but Frankl says we're made for meaning. So he's a Hebrew. He kind of derived this from his faith. And the one thing that the premise of his work is that the root of anxiety is unfulfilled responsibility. So it's this idea that you're made for something, but you're not doing it. And so you kind of are covered in this sphere of purposelessness, and you're not really sure that Psalm 139 is true, that God's works are wonderful, that when he made us, he said that he had plans and intentions. All our days were written and planned before one of them began, which is why his timing is awesome. We don't have to stress about waking to our calling yesterday. He knows exactly when he's going to plan it and how he's going to do it. And so that inspired so much of my work, just reading just everything about the way he just really, it was just geared toward the mind and how our faith intersects with that. So that would be probably the biggest. I mean, Gabe teases that he's my boyfriend, but he died at 93. So he's
Can't
awesome.
be. Yeah, that's okay. I have some of those dead people crushes as well, like people that I wish I could be more like. It's cool to hear you talk about those folks because I can just see their influence on the work that you're doing now. I think one of the reasons that's possible for you is that both of you really embody this posture of humility and of the need to listen and to learn.
I'm one of the most humble people I've ever met.
I'm sure you are, yeah. Aren't we all?
They didn't get that. It's a joke.
No one laughed. But one of the things, Gabe, specifically with Q, one of the postures that you are trying to convince people to embody in their daily lives is this need to listen. If I could summarize Q even, I would just say, it's okay to listen. Like, it's okay to shut up and listen for a little while. We tend to live in a world that wants to talk more than we listen. So what do you think it means for us to try and listen, to really listen in 2019?
Well, part of what we describe Q as is a place where you stay curious. We think Christians ought to be some of the most curious people in the world. God's created this amazing place and amazing people, and he wants us to love them through listening, through learning, through understanding their stories, trying to see where there's divine intervention maybe playing out in their story that they didn't even recognize. But when we stay curious and we have this posture that we can learn something from every single person, whether they look differently than us, came from a different background than us, talk differently, believe differently, there's actually value because they're made in the image of God. And when we approach people with that humility and say, look, I don't know it all. I can learn a lot from a conversation with you. We experience things that we otherwise would have avoided. I think of a good friend of my life, David Bailey, African-American leader, lives in Richmond, Virginia. And about 6 years ago, we started having the conversation around racism. And I realized how much I needed to learn that I never understood about what was taking place within the African American community as it related to race and as it related to white privilege. And some of these conversations that in a lot of places people don't want to talk about it. Well, by listening, by submitting really to his authority and understanding of this, he was able to bring me along, and he was patient too. He was a listener too. He wasn't just there to tell me everything I'd gotten wrong, but more to say, hey, look what we could do more of. Here's how we could work together.
Yeah.
And so I think that's critical. I'd say secondly, our culture definitely promotes that you should say everything you're feeling in the moment, right? And that's where social media or Snapchat and all these different vehicles that can allow us to just say what we're thinking, say what we're feeling, can sometimes lead us to say things without reflection. I think as human beings, we were designed to actually reflect on what we think about things, not to just react. That's not wise. That's instinctual, but it's not necessarily wisdom. And as human beings, God's asked us to be wise and to bring wisdom, not foolishness, into this world. And so I think each of us, if we just kind of take account, take a deep breath, don't always feel this pressure that we have to respond. We have to get our opinion out there and listen more. We'll actually have a lot more to add to the conversation, or to when real questions start to come our way. We'll have taken the time to reflect and be able to offer something helpful.
That's really good. And I think that you mentioned social media. That goes beyond just waiting to push send or post or something. That is an interpersonal reality as well, waiting to respond before we actually have taken the time to listen. That's really good. Rebecca, you kind of touched on a season in your life that launched you into a ministry that you didn't even know you were going to be entering. I know we have been blessed and honored by the frank honesty that you shared your story with mental health and with anxiety. Would you mind just sharing with our students a little bit more of the background of that story?
Sure. How many of you understand like the distinction maybe between panic attack and like the low hum of anxiety? How many of you feel anxiety? Okay, I see that hand. So basically, panic attacks is a ramp of anxiety to the point where your body is now physically responding in a way that you can't understand. And so it tends to be an adrenaline rush, like the movie Panic Room, like you're trapped, and if you don't escape, you'll die. It's like there's not a rational thought happening at that point, but your body's just reacting in a way that like you are not safe, you've got to get out, you're under duress. So for me, that began on an airplane from Atlanta back to LaGuardia, and we're taxiing, a lot of turbulence, and just something rises in me. I was reading a book from a friend on that flight, and it was called Pilgrimage of a Soul, and it was this awesome contemplative book, but the middle chapter is called Death, and I decided the sanguine melancholic in me was going to just read the chapter on death, like let's just go ahead and cut to the chase, but that was probably not the best idea right before this panic attack began. And so when that escalated for me, I didn't have language for it, I didn't know what to do, I just knew that I could not stay in that space, so I ran on the plane to the front while we're still in the air and looked insane. But what that began that day continued for the next year and a half. And so it was in anything that was small and enclosed, trains, planes, elevators, subways, crowds. So basically every means of transportation in New York City. And so in the course of 18 months, I just became crippled and small, like a shell of who I was, and I didn't want to really step outside. And finally I had some friends who just asked about it a year and a half in, and they asked if they could pray for me, and I was like, sure. I didn't in that season, I saw mental health in my family line, and I just thought, well, now it's kind of my turn, it's genetic. And so that morning, they prayed for me, went to sleep. That morning at 3 in the morning, I have one out of a dream, wake up, it begins again. No longer confined to small spaces, now it's just like all the time. And so Gabe's praying, he knows the drill, and I can't speak at that point, but I really do believe that God just met me in that moment, and the Spirit of God came on me, gave me words I didn't have, and I just said, rescue me, deliver me, I cannot do this without you. And in the middle of that moment, my body just broke on the bed. And there might be a name for this in Pentecostal circles, but this Baptist girl has no idea what is happening. So I'm just kind of laying there, and I can't move, and it's almost as if I experienced the rescue of God for the first time in the 30 years that I'd called myself a Christian. And I remember stepping out the next day going, I don't know what's happening. I feel like God and I are kind of like having this new experience. But the thing with being sick is you look inward and you only see what is, you become very self-absorbed when you're sick, right? You see everything that's wrong and you focus on what is sick. But when a healing journey begins, you look up and you look out and you see everyone else. And that day, for the first time, walking around the streets of New York, I was able to see women just like me. Women walking through pain, through fear, having stories, you know, like just kind of seeing behind the eyes a little bit of like just what they were navigating, what they were facing. And that really propelled that for me. And so God just kind of, the irony now is that he puts me on a plane almost every week to talk about this. So this old place of panic is now a sanctuary in the sky. And it just goes to show that like what the enemy doesn't intend for harm, God will actually use those exact circumstances and use them for his glory, because Revelation 12:11 says that the enemy is bound by two things. It's Christ's blood and our testimony. And a lot of times I think Jesus looks at us and he's like, I did my part, and I want to give you a story ultimately that you can't shut up about, because you can't take credit for it. You can't, you know, act like you just willed your way into walking this healing thing out. I interrupted your life by my power, and I brought you rescue. And so not long after that, I read Psalm 18, the words of David, and that is the rescue psalm. And I remember just like being so struck by it, where he said, you reached down from on high and you took hold of me and you pulled me out of a deep pit and you rescued me because you delighted in me. And then, you know, it goes on and on and on, but really it's just this kind of like, this exercise of David, right? How he's on these highs and he has these lows, but the reason why he was a man after God's own heart was because he didn't withhold his heart from God. He never tried to shrink back or protect God or disarm God or not say all the things. He actually had a heart of confession that was readily available to God. And I have found in the 8 years since this time, since this season, that confession has always brought me back to freedom. Always, you know. It doesn't mean the enemy's like, oh, sweet, she's no longer under, you know, because what happens is when you start to walk healing out, he's like, he doubles down and he wants to come after you all the more because he wants to make you not credible or make you just get full of yourself or something. And so I think the practice even since then that I encourage a lot of people is like rescue is a whisper away, literally. And it might need to look like that every day. It might be every week. It might be spread out a little further, maybe every month. But there's a psalm that says, you rescue me again and again and again. And I think when he becomes our daily portion, whether we're feeling like just maybe stress, maybe we're feeling, you know, low-grade anxious to full tilt, like extreme depression, and we need to like crisis counseling, whatever that looks like, it begins with this honest and open dialogue with God that never ends. Nothing is off limits for him.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that with us and giving us a little bit more of an insight into that story. I'm thinking about, you know, the morning where you're walking on the street and for the first time you began to look around and see people who were going through the same thing that you were going through, had a similar story to you. It's not secret knowledge that anxiety is on the rise in our world. We could probably point to a number of factors that contribute to that anxiety. But what do you think it means for us to find peace in the midst of anxiety? What does it mean, especially in our world, in our American context, to find peace in the midst of anxiety?
Well, a lot of people talk about peace without the Prince of Peace, right? And so I remember being in Israel 3 years ago, and it was a peacemaking trip. And it was between Israel and Palestinian mothers who had both lost their sons under the hands of each other in war. And so we did a lot of like peacemaking exercises that week, and we made jam, and we went on walks, and we talked, and it was a beautiful week. But the end of the week, I found myself on the Sea of Galilee, right where Jesus did the Beatitudes, and it's like barbed wire fence, and everything's barricaded, and I start crying because I'm like, I don't think we've prayed together or said the name of Jesus in the last 7 days. And I just picture Jesus right there saying, you know, blessed are those who mourn because they'll be comforted. And the peace I give, the world cannot give. And I just was reminded that we can't actually know true peace without Christ. We can want it, the world's gonna offer us peace in a prescription. It's gonna offer us peace in counseling. It's gonna offer us peace in relationships. It's gonna offer us peace in idolatry or possessions or material. And the thing that's true though is God just says, don't let your heart be troubled. Don't let it be afraid. Believe in God, believe also in me. And so Jesus is basically constantly coming back to going like, I am your peace. It's not that I extend you a portion of peace for today. No, when I enter in and make my home in you, I become your peace. And so when I stopped thinking of it like a transaction, like Jesus, just give me enough peace for today. Like give me enough peace for this test or this stressful situation or this relationship that's really hard. Instead I go, Jesus, I need you to get right up in the middle of this right now. Like I don't want to kind of do this sideways energy trying to just affect some change here. I want you to enter in and come and consume this by your supernatural power, by your spirit, by your peace. And so you be my peace. And so if you're getting on a plane and you're afraid to fly, I'm very familiar. I've tried to walk off many planes, tried to jump off many subways, tried to exit many elevators. It's not possible, I've learned, but you do look funny trying. But even now, there will be moments where I'll feel kind of this threat of the enemy because he is the author of fear, so he's going to be a bully and he's going to continue to try to threaten. But even when I kind of start to sense that coming on, I'll just say, Jesus, you are my peace. And I'll continue just to read the words of Jesus that says, I'm the Prince of Peace. And you know what's crazy is that when we take on the armor of God, the final thing is we get to be messengers of the gospel of peace. We get to walk in shoes that carry peace. And I do believe that anxiety is coming against the church because the church was made and destined from the womb to be carriers of peace. And so of course the enemy would be like, if I can't get them to willfully deny me or sin against me, I'll just threaten them and make them afraid until they become mute. And yet Jesus is like, no, this is the time where you find your footing and you find your voice and be reminded the destiny that you do have appointed in the womb, which is to be one who carries peace because you carry me with you.
Wow, that's so good. I'm remembering again the symbol of this plane, a place where you once experienced anxiety and fear is now a tool for you to bring peace. What an incredible story of redemption that is. So thanks for doing that. Gabe, I have another question for you as we kind of wrap up our time. Q, all your writing, all of your endeavors to help empower and prepare the church, it's all contributions to how to live Christian life. My question is, you could be a pastor, you could be working in a church in an official capacity. Why is it that you're doing what you're doing? And maybe more particularly, that one I want to lean into is, why are you doing it the way that you're doing it? What does it mean for you to do something that contributes to the church, but maybe is happening outside of an official church?
Well, I think, each of us, as I said earlier, I think has an assignment God kind of calls us towards. It was very clear to me at 26 years old that this was the path I was to walk on. Yeah. And it wasn't to be a pastor, but it was to come alongside pastors. It was to come alongside entrepreneurs, those who are going to create the films and music that we're listening to and consuming, and the video gaming and technology and all of that, and to try to help them because they're on the front lines of culture. They're trying to live out their faith, many times in places that have a pretty leveraged opportunity to influence the imagination of where our world could go. And it was very clear to me that that was the place I was just supposed to serve. And the way in which we do Q, which is built around questions, that's what Q stands for, is the idea of asking any question. There's no question off limits, no topic that we as Christians shouldn't be engaging, and create space for people to wrestle with the issues of our moment. Because as Schaeffer said in 1968, if our faith can't answer the questions that you have today, that your friends have today, the things you're really wrestling with, and it can't stand up to that, then it's of no use. answering questions our parents were dealing with or he was dealing with 60 years ago, that's one thing. But talking to the issues of our moment is critical. And that's where I've always felt called, is to keep Q right at the forefront of the discussions, the debates, the trends, the topics, the issues, and make sure as Christians we're not afraid to talk about those things. In fact, we welcome them because we know when we talk about them, truth can come to bear on that situation. It can enlighten people, and they can start to wake up and see how God's word, how what Jesus has taught us, how the ways in which we're called to live as the church are actually part of the healing balm and part of the solution to creating a more flourishing world.
That's really good. And I think it's such a timely word for a room full of students who are thinking about what does life look like? If I'm really going to live this Christian life, what does it mean for me to use the gifts and talents and influence that I have for the good of the kingdom? So thank you to both of you. Would you mind joining me in thanking Rebecca and Gabe for being with us this morning? I'm gonna pray here in just a second, but I want to just draw your attention to a couple of nuggets that I know I'm going to take with me. One is finding the place and the space and the gifts and talents that God has given me to make a unique contribution to the advancement of his kingdom in the world. Each of you are influencers in your own right, and I believe that God has positioned you to use that for the good of the person that sits right next to you. So I'm taking that with me. I'm taking with me the idea that we have an ability to bring peace in an anxious world. Our campus can be an anxious campus, and I want to invite each of you to think about the ways that you can be carriers, vessels of peace to those that you go to school with. So thank you for being with us this morning. Let me pray for us, and then you'll be dismissed. God, thank you so much for this space where we have an opportunity to recalibrate and to recenter ourselves and to remind ourselves of the truth that maybe we know cerebrally, but we need to be reminded of in our hearts, that you have called us and have empowered us and have gifted us for the good of this world. That you haven't called us away from this world, you've called us into it to be meaning makers and culture makers and peace bringers. Thank you for that commission. We're honored by it, and I pray that you would give us a new vision, new insight into ways that we can live into that calling this morning as we leave this place. Thank you for your son, Jesus. It's in whose name we pray and give thanks this morning. Amen. Have a great day. Go in peace.